it's very exciting to be able to talk about this particular subject. As a historian, it's quite rare to come across pieces of work either in primary material or secondary sources that completely open up a new subject in a refreshed and exciting way. And so when a number of years ago I came across Richard Duckett's book on SOE, it sat on the shelf for a long time because I've got lots of books that sit on my shelf for a long time. But I eventually got around to reading it, and I realized within a few days of getting stuck into this book that we had something really quite remarkable here. Now, Richard doesn't yet realize how remarkable his book is, but I'm here tonight to tell you that this is quite an extraordinary book that places a new perspective on the entire story of the Burma campaign in 1944 and 45. And it's a story that's largely been ignored by traditional historians who have been quite rightly concerned with the mass operations of conventional forces and the Chindits, and to a lesser extent the Northern Combat Area Command, Stilwell's forces in the north. But the story of Special Operations Executive, which Richard has brilliantly described in his book, and you all need to go and make sure you get him to place his name in your own copies tonight, is fabulous. And it's one of those things that, as I said at the start, is really exciting for an historian to discover a new dimension. And tonight we hope to be able to describe what that new dimension in the historiography and the story of the Burma campaign actually is. That's the book. Well, you will know that when the British were thrown out of Burma by the rampaging Imperial Japanese Army in 1942, there were no real plans. There was no time to construct any plans to leave behind in Burma a stay-behind force or guerrilla forces or anything of a formal or even unconventional kind at all. There had been some thinking about it, and Richard's going to touch on that in a moment, but no plans had been put in place. So rapid was General Aida's advance into first Rangoon and then up the Irrawaddy and the Sittang to Mandalay, and then pushed the British out in May 1942. There was one individual, however, who decided to stay with his returning Burma Rifles soldiers in Burma, this fellow here, Captain Hugh Segan. When the Burma army left Burma in May 1942 en route to Manipur in its withdrawal to India, the option was given to soldiers in the Burma Rifles to return to their villages with their equipment and weapons and to await further instruction. Well, Hugh Segan, who is a member of the 19th Hyderabad, attached to the 20th Burma Rifles, decided to stay with his men. We're not entirely sure why. There might have been logistical reasons for that prohibited or prevented his return to India, but he made the decision to stay with his soldiers. And in a very short period of time, through to October 1943, Hugh Segan built up the bare bones of an unconventional guerrilla operation in the Karen Hills in eastern Burma, the hills of eastern Burma. And without knowing it, he created the essence of a new way of fighting in Burma that wasn't on anyone's mind in 1942, and indeed wasn't on his mind at all. So by October 1943, what Hugh Segan had managed to achieve on his own with his 3,000 Karen irregulars without any weapons or ammunition supplied since the retreat in 1942, the British managed to make contact with him, and the story of SOE really began from that time. So I'm going to ask Richard now to describe to us how the Allies started thinking strategically about the use of special forces, or what Hugh Segan was attempting to do off his own back without any support, any weapons, any equipment, any communication with home base in eastern Burma. So what were the early days of operations or planning in India about what Hugh Segan was doing? What did that constitute?
Well, Special Operations Executive was formed in July 1940, and it was originally meant for Europe. And the British government had a very clear policy towards the Far East, and that was don't provoke Japan. We can't handle a war over there as well as over here, the home islands being threatened. But the earliest mention that I've found in the archives of sending a mission out to the Far East was in the very next month of August 1940. The decision's made in September, and they're getting ready to go by October 1940. And the man chosen to head what was named the Oriental Mission by the men who went out there, his official name was Scapula. It's also got a name of Operation Puma. They went out to the Far East under Valentine St. John Killary, arriving in Singapore in May 1941. May 1941, of course, the Japanese didn't start their war in the Far East until December, at least against European colonial targets. So the Oriental Mission went out to the Far East. In the beginning, there was even before Killary, there was a couple of men that went out to do some exploratory projects and start letting people know that this secret organisation was coming. And the governors of places like Singapore, Malaysia were given instructions to help this secret organisation that was coming. They set up Special Training School 101, STS 101 at Tanjong Balai in Singapore. And they actually were putting recruits through there from Burma as early as November 1941. Alfred Ottaway, who was a mine manager in Tavoy region of southern Burma, he went with a load of his Anglo-Burmese workers, was put through STS 101. Apparently they were good material, and the observer from Europe was really impressed with them and reported back to London that things are underway. So there is this idea of stay-behinds. Malaya, we've heard about how it was stalled for Malaya. There's lots of work being done on Malaya. And they did start, and Seagram was the nucleus of this at the beginning. Seagram joined SOE, the Oriental Mission, in January 1942. He needed to be poached from the army. He wanted to use him as a scout. Scarce resources, scarce personnel. There's quite, all the way through the war, there's this real competition for resources in the Far East. It really is aptly described as bottom of the pile in terms of resources, right through and until 1945, really, when the supply situation gets sorted out to a much larger extent than in these early days. So yes, you're absolutely right. Seagram was put into the jungle in the end of January 1942. He's got a load of captured Italian rifles from the North African desert, some dodgy ammunition to go with them. Between him and a few other guys, Noel Boyd and another mine worker, they managed to raise about 3,000 karen, and they're armed with anything they can lay their hands on, crossbows, and more ancient sort of museum pieces, and told, do what you can to attack the Japanese line of communication when they come. But what they didn't expect at this point was that most of Burma would fall. I say most of. If you look at a map, any map that you see shows that all of Burma was occupied by the Japanese. That's not right. That's inaccurate. Due to some very important action by the Oriental Mission, the northern part of Burma wasn't claimed by the Japanese and was really important to NCAC later on. So there's 3,000 odd karen with a couple of officers, 3 or 4 officers in the southern Shan states when the Japanese come in, but they're not very well equipped. They haven't had time to train the levies. They are left with some sort of, the word that the archives always use is stiffening. They've been stiffened. The levies, you need to stiffen the volunteers with some Burma Rifles personnel. And in the Burma Rifles and the various Burma Rifle units, there's about 20,000 men, 20,000 Chin, Karen, some Ba Maw, and Kachin, of course. As you say, they're told to go back to their villages, and we know that around 6,186, I think it's about that, did actually go out to India. The rest stayed in Burma. So there is sort of allowing for casualties. We could say roughly around 15,000 trained men waiting for the British to return, which they wait, and they come when they're called.
So what we have is, in 1943, is a situation actually where in central Burma, the Ba Maw part of Burma, we have around the hilly outskirts of Burma, if you're aware of the topography, a whole bunch of hill tribes, the Chins, the Nagas, the Katians, and the Karens in particular, who are ripe for recruitment into these special or irregular types of operations. And by 1943, the end of 1943, actually a number of these are significantly underway. The Chin levies have been underway for some time. The Northern Combat Area Command have employed Kachin irregulars right from the beginning, as Stilwell begins his march down to create the next Lido Road, or the Stilwell Road from Lido. The Burma Road, which was called the Stilwell Road from Lido, has lots of different names. But the Karens in eastern Burma are clearly, geographically, a long, long way away from the logistical support that India can supply, particularly when the Japanese were about to advance into India, in any case in 1944. But by 1945, I'm just going to flick forward and say that the SOE operations that Rich is going to describe and has described in his book had a dramatic strategic effect in Burma. So it's going to come around pretty quickly. It's going to come from the end of 1943 through to March, April, May 1945. It happens in a very, very short period of time. In that period of time also we have another, what the British Army then called and still does, long-range penetration operation, which you all know as the Chindits. Two Chindit operations, one in 43, Longcloth, and the other in 1944, Operation Thursday. Undertaken by this man here, Ord Wingate. And Ord Wingate, in fact, had originally been sent to Burma in 1941 by Wavell, who was the Commander-in-Chief India, in order to be able to set up an irregular training school in Mamio in order to be able to do the sort of things that Seagram actually ended up having to do on his own. But tonight is not about the Chindits. Tonight we want to talk about a long-range penetration operation, a series of operations that hasn't had any of the exposure of the Chindits, but which, in my view, achieved far greater strategic effect than anything those fabulous guys managed to do in northern Burma. Now, everything's got to start, everything's got to have a beginning, Richard. So where did SOE operations, so forget about dear old Hugh Segan, formal SOE operations, how did they begin in Burma? Who started thinking about them and how were they applied?
Right, well, we just had a picture of Killary up, and beside him was a picture of the Governor of Burma, Sir Reginald Dorman Smith. As far as I can tell, Sir Reginald Dorman Smith and Killary got on very well. They met in London before they went out to the Far East in 1941. And of all the countries in the Far East in which the Oriental Mission operated, because of the relationship between these two men, more seems to have happened there than anywhere else, which makes the Burma story all that more exciting, and the foundations of it to get to the operations of 1945, which were so significant. So the Oriental Mission comes to an end in April 1942. Burma is pretty much lost. At this point, what I was about to say before was that they didn't expect all of Burma to be lost. They thought there was going to be a battle in the middle of Burma and push the Japanese back out. That never happened, of course. There's the retreat to India. This was inevitable, I guess, by April 1942. And so the Oriental Mission was folded into India Mission. Now, India Mission had been set up under this guy here, Colin Hercules Mackenzie. Now, I think it's worth saying a little bit about Mackenzie. I think he was very well respected by everyone out in the theatre. He's the only head of an SOE mission who stayed in post for the entire war. He had tremendous contacts through he was on the board of J&P Coates. He knew Lord Linlithgow, the Viceroy of India, extremely well. And so he took on what was left of the Oriental Mission as they limped in from Singapore, those who escaped from Singapore, and those who came out from Burma. The last SOE Oriental Mission guys came out from Burma by about August of 1942. So Colin Mackenzie, his original India mission had been focused on India and the countries lying to the west, Iran, Afghanistan, and the sort of more of the Middle East. But now he had a complete rejig of the area that he was in control of. And he was made responsible for all of the territory to the east of India that had been lost to the Japanese in their offensives of 1942. So it was reorganised, as you can see here, into Group A, Group B, Group C. C is China, and Group A, you've got Burma in there. So he's suddenly tasked with this massive job, this huge geographical area, as you can see from the map there. Huge geographical area. And what have they got to get back into these occupied territories, to get personnel back into these occupied territories? They've got 6 absolutely worn-out Hudsons. The Hudson aircraft didn't have the range to get to Malaya, Sumatra, or most of those countries there. It had the range to get into Burma, just about, and out again. Also at their disposal, I say at their disposal loosely, were the submarines based at Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, of course. They had their own regular submarine missions to patrols to do for the Navy. If it fitted in with an SOE plan, then they might be able to get some bods on board and do a submarine mission. This didn't really come to much until 1945, when the submarines were used to get personnel into Malaya. So this tremendous geographical area, competition over resources to get the men into the occupied territories, with SIS as well, the Secret Intelligence Service. So very difficult to get back into any of those other territories other than Burma at this stage. And very quickly, they look to get back into Burma, and these first missions go in from January 1943. And 1943 is a series of learning on the job. If you're familiar with SOE in France, there's lots of setbacks with SOE in France in those first years. And so it was for SOE's India mission. You might know it as Force 136. It's not actually known as Force 136 until March 1944. Its cover name at the moment is GSI bracket K close bracket, and the GSI just stands for General Service Intelligence, and the K was, I don't know, just for cover. It doesn't seem to have any meaning. So they start trying to get back into Burma. They want to know what's going on since it's been occupied by the Japanese. So the first mission that went in was Operation Flimwell. And the idea behind that was to get a couple of Karen agents into the Delta area, the Bassine area of Burma, and see what was going on. They went in, and it all went wrong because they landed with a crash on someone's house and knocked over all the pots and pans in the kitchen. And they lost their WT set and had to go on the run, and they weren't heard of until 1945. Other missions that went in was Operation Harlington, which was the attempt to contact Seagram. There was another mission, Operation Dilwin, to the Kachin in the north, which was launched in February 1943. That actually stayed in the field right through until after the end of war in August 1945. So that was a long-running operation. Significant help to the Americans, and actually was the source of most of Slim's intelligence, even though he didn't know that it was coming from SOE, which we'll touch on later, I believe. Other missions like Spears, Operation Spears, was to the far northeastern part of the Shan states, the Kokang area, which borders on China. That ended up more with, it was less about fighting the Japanese than actually sparring with the Chinese over the territory. Who was going to have the Kokang area? Was it going to fall under Chinese control, or was it going to fall under Burmese control? Burma colonial control, British control, of course. So there's lots of political intrigue in the Spears operation. It didn't actually come to anything much in terms of fighting the Japanese. So there were lots of failures in that regard. But we're going on to Operation Harlington.
I'm just giving the examples of the support in India.
Yeah, the training. Just like the army that limped back into India, SOE needed to retrain, rearm, re-equip, work out training programs, They needed to get the learning from SOE in Europe transferred out to them. So there seems to be quite a lot of transference of knowledge from Europe to the Far East, not least in parachute training. There's so many accidents at the air landing school at Chaklala that the officer in charge of Ringway, where you were parachute trained for SOE here in the UK, was sent out to India to report on why there were so many fatalities at the air landing school at Chaklala. There's a whole file of photographs showing the mess of parachutes and what was going wrong. And it got to the point where personnel were getting cold feet. They weren't going to jump out the aircraft. And it wasn't helped when two Chinese agents, Operation Wakering, jumped out of their aircraft and their parachutes failed to open. And with all the intrigue going on with the Operation Spears mission, and then their own agents hitting the ground, quite literally, it led to more tension with the Chinese. So there's a lot of inter-allied tension, especially with the Chinese. But to get trained, there's Chaklala is in modern-day Pakistan. You've got jungle training in Belgaum, as well as in India, as well as down in Ceylon. And you've got agent training outside Calcutta. And if you just add up the mileage and the time that it took to get trained, it gives you a sense of just how vast just India was, let alone the whole theatre that India mission had to cover. So they've got a Herculean task in front of them, which they're trying to manage in this sort of period between the end of the retreat, middle of 1942, until they get the liberators, really, in February 1944, which is a game changer.
I'm going to introduce Peacock now, and one of the observations that I'm going to make and ask Richard to elaborate on is the importance of powerful individuals in making decisions and pushing things through. Because despite the fact that actually there was an enormous amount of political intrigue going on, there were very few resources, it was the task of getting into Burma to deliver any sensible intelligence, let alone guerrilla-type fighting, seemed absolutely impossible, insurmountable in 1943. And yet all these types of operations, these unconventional operations, require people of extraordinary vision and courage, moral courage, to be able to get them done. And I think this is one of the outstanding features of Richard's work, identifying those individuals, Major Peacock here being one of them. But from the moment that the retreat took place into Manipur in 1942, unconventional forces were being pulled together in an ad hoc fashion in order to be able to do what conventional forces had failed to do. And it's really important to recognize that this underlying feature of thinking in India Command in particular carried on through to 1944. The belief that unconventional forces, native levies, armed guerrillas, local guerrillas armed by Allied troops could actually make a significant difference. That belief always existed. There was always the idea that these could be what we call today in modern terms a force multiplier. And this was led in 1942, not least of all, by Wavell, who was the commander-in-chief, of course, who was the man who gave Wingate his wings. And he also encouraged the construction of V-Force and Pforce as well.
So Pforce, named after Lieutenant Colonel Edgar Peacock. Peacock lied about his age, so he was actually 6 years older than what he told them. He was born in 1893. But he'd served in the forest companies in Burma. He knew Burma very well, and what he did was really important. There's at least two people who stand out as having quite an impact on the way things turned out. Because it could have been very different. Because the army didn't trust SOE. They didn't know what it was all about, other than a bunch of civilians being promoted very quickly when career officers had spent a long time trying to achieve the same rank. And what Edgar Pico did with Pforce is he worked in front of Gracie's 20 Division on the Imphal front in the Chindwin area. And it says everywhere you read about it in the files, this is not proper SOE work, because it wasn't. This was working through the lines. SOE is supposed to be hundreds of miles behind the lines raising the guerrillas. They're not supposed to be working through the lines like they were here. So it's always described as not being proper SOE work, but it's really important because what he did is he got Gracie on side. Gracie reported back to Slim and starts getting the army, hang on, this organisation is doing something worthwhile. And Pforce, all it was doing was just collecting intelligence, collecting agents, bringing them through the lines, sending them back through to the villages, seeing what they could find out, going out on patrol, learning important things, such as how the Japanese react to an ambush. Presumably it's different to how the Germans did. But they were so good at it that the Japanese apparently started calling them the foe with fearless eyes, according to one document. And a lot of the people that were recruited during these Pforce days, it went in about mid-1943 and was pulled out. It was sort of a phased withdrawal after the Japanese attack on Imphal and Kohima. So from between March and May, is a phased withdrawal out of the area. But they earned the trust of the military here, of the army, and they honed skills which were used to terrible effect later on.
So what we have here is that really important interface at a number of levels between the 14th Army, who had a natural conventional distaste and distrust of anything that was unconventional, and the knowledge of what was going on the other side of the fence, essentially the other side of the Chinwin River. And Richard's absolutely right. Slim had two sources of intelligence. The first was Ultra. He had signals intelligence, the Far Eastern version of Bletchley Park, and only he and one other person in SEAC had access to that information. None of his corps commanders had that information. It was so secret, it was extraordinary. But the problem with that information, and it's really available now, is how sparse it was. It gave high-level Japanese perspectives on what was going to happen. It gave the 15th of March 1944 as the start date for Operation C, the invasion of India, for instance. But it lacked nuance. And what Major Peacock managed to do was create a relationship between the theory of operating behind enemy lines and picking up information and its actuality. So Pforce was able to go out there and confirm that the Japanese 15th and 33rd and 31st Divisions were indeed marching to the Chinwin, and was able to give quite precise information to Douglas Gracie, commander of the GOC of the 20th Indian Division, and the intelligence that was coming across the Chinwin in February and March 1944 was exceptional, in part and largely down to the work of Pforce, as Peacock's force was known. And the other thing that's really important to understand is the other dimension that I described, that I alluded to, is the relationship with the local people. What Peacock was able to do was to demonstrate that actually, well managed, the local people could be fabulous sources of intelligence and of support, and indeed, in due course, of military action. Now, it wasn't the case that the Allies decided to use the Ba Maw people in the center of Burma to support guerrilla operations, but certainly they were very happy to do what Seagram had done in the Karen states and the Chin levies were doing in the Chin states, south of the Naga Hills, south of Manipur, and raise up guerrilla bands from within the local tribes people and arm them and use them as part of all the military tools that Slim had to deploy. So Peacock is actually the turning point, in my view, of the way in which SOE became less of an intelligence gathering idea to becoming something really actual on the ground and persuading the military chain of command, Gracie, Scoons, Slim, of its military prowess and its potential. But you'll all recognize that deploying guerrilla forces behind enemy lines, particularly employing Burmese people, tribes people, or the Ba Maw people who form the majority of the people in the center of Burma, was going to be politically difficult, not least of all because we had a government of Burma. The colonial government of Burma had gone and shipped itself off to Shimla in the foothills of the Himalayas, where it still considered itself the government of Burma, and fought at every opportunity to assert its prerogatives over the army. And we had a lot of political sensitivities as well, Richard, to be able to resolve. So what were the challenges that SOE had, the political challenges that SOE had in actually achieving success in Burma? Not least of all because some of the people SOE wanted to use weren't really supporters of the colonial enterprise.
Yeah, this is really quite a fascinating story of how hierarchies get turned on their head in the extraordinary circumstances of war, and how chains of command can get circumvented to make things happen when you've got the right people in the right place with the right drive to do it. And I certainly consider Mountbatten to be one of those, as we'll see with one of the slides later on with what he did. The main argument is, what are you going to do with Burmese nationalists who you've armed and trained to fight the Japanese once the Japanese are defeated? Why are you going to arm these people who had marched into Burma in January 1942 as the Burma Independence Army alongside the Japanese? Why should you work with what colonial officials called the Burma Traitor Army, the BTA? And this caused splits within the British camp, which are fascinating, I found utterly fascinating to unravel. Because on the one hand, you've got the intrigue with the Chinese that we've been talking about, you've got the intrigue with the Americans who don't want to restore empire, and you've got all these different opinions within the British camp. And the book covers you can see here are where the accusation was made that SOE didn't follow procedure and cut people out of the decision-making process. And I don't think that's quite right in the end. In 1942, two Burmese communists had realised which side their bread was buttered vis-à-vis the Japanese, and they had marched out to India and said, "We want to work with you to get rid of the Japanese." And the British had coolly received them, Thien Phi and Tin Shui. They were communists as well, which didn't help too much. But they decided, SOE decided quite early on, and here's another pivotal man, actually, is Major Eric Battersby, who had been the governor's ADC. He decides, yeah, we're going to work with the Burmese nationalists as early as November 1943. And they work very hard to get, they really want information out of Burma. What's going on? What's been the reaction of the people to the Japanese occupation? What's been the reaction, furthermore, to Japanese independence? This independence that was given to the Burmese on the 1st of August of 1943. What's the reaction? So they worked very hard to get these agents in. And there was a lot of people on the colonial side, specifically the Civil Affairs Service, Burma, who were very much against using these Burmese nationalists to win the war in Burma. And arguments like this one here, the clandestine struggle might help to evict the enemy, but it's going to leave a mess afterwards. And this argument actually rattled on through the decades. If you look at the Mackenzie papers in the Imperial War Museum, there's letters between him and Mountbatten saying, we did the right thing. You know, this is in the 1980s. You know, we did the right thing. By using the Burmese nationalists, we made the right decision. And they look to places like the mess in Greece, the mess in Indonesia, the mess for the French in French Indochina. And there's still split. This wartime division in opinion on how to use Burmese nationalists continued for at least the next 4 decades towards the end of these men's lives. So there's quite a fight within the British camp. What SOE does is they go directly to the Governor of Burma, Dorman Smith and say, this is what we want to do. And Dorman Smith, he says, I'm all for trying something new. Yeah, let's do it. They get him on side. They talk to Mountbatten. Mountbatten's all for it. They get Mountbatten on side. They're all right, we need the army commander on side now. Let's go to Slim. And they do on the 30th of December, 1944. And they put Slim straight on these things. And Slim goes all out in support of SOE operations. But you've still got these officers from the Civil Affairs Service, General Pearce and Brigadier Prescott, who are vehemently opposed to this. And also you've got the creation of Allied Land Forces Southeast Asia under General Leese, and he needed convincing too. And this is where you get the stern letter from Mountbatten to General Leese saying, this is my decision, step away.
We've got this extraordinary scenario. We're trying to follow the slides, but getting an academic to follow a script is really, really difficult. So we've got the situation where actually the challenge is to be able to persuade everyone in Burma who's supporting the Japanese to actually change sides. And the trigger was these two communists in 1942 who realized actually they weren't going to get what they wanted, which was an independent communist Burma out of the Japanese, because the Japanese had demonstrated very quickly and very early on that their independence was what's the word I want? Was false. It was there was no substance to it. But then you have on the Allied side, particularly the British side, this political failure to recognize that the world had suddenly changed. The Japanese invasion had changed everything politically. And the strategic imperative that had come down all the way from the combined chiefs of staff, all the way down to the operations on the ground, was not to recreate in Burma what had been lost in 1942. This is really fundamental that everyone understands this. The political imperative was different. The military imperative took priority, which was to defeat the Japanese and to continue to support China through the hump airlift in lieu of the Burma Road. Once the war had been won, political decisions could then be made, but you don't reserve your right to make a political decision whilst you're fighting a war. This is really, really important. And it's quite extraordinary, I think, looking at Richard's book and looking at the debates that took place to see how fierce these political battles were. And Richard's right. Mountbatten and Dorman Smith, to his credit, and Leese eventually, and Slim, put the kibosh on the political discussions and said, ask the question, do we think that persuading Aung San and the Burmese Defence Army to change sides, do we think that raising Burmese and arming Burmese irregulars will do us any good strategically? We need to do it with our eyes open. We need to recognize that there will be political repercussions of this, but do we think we can manage them? What's the most important thing for us now? Is it thinking about how Burma is going to be governed after the war, or is it defeating the Japanese? And in any case, if it's thinking about how Burma is going to be governed after the war, if we think we're simply going to reimpose Shimla in 1942 on Rangoon again, we don't really understand how the world's changed. So Mountbatten gets a lot of stick, but actually Mountbatten made the final decision, the right decision, to allow SOE to gain the support of whoever they wished in Burma to be able to fight the war. So you've got Eric Battersby here.
Yeah, he's in charge of running the Burmese nationalist agents, and I think he's an unsung hero. He's done a tremendous job, Eric Battersby. And a huge amount of intelligence comes out from central Burma and Rangoon through the agents that he's running. And most of them, they're running through the Arakan. And that's where we can move smoothly on to the next one, and Tom Carew, another one of the outstanding personalities here. A lot hinged on this man's operations, not just in the Arakan, but also later on in central Burma. that he was able to get parachuted into the headquarters of the anti-fascist organisation in March 1945, this time codenamed Weasel, was based on his success as Operation Camel in Arakan. And he was almost ready to pack up in Arakan and go home because the Arakanese weren't playing ball. They weren't wanting to fight the Japanese quite as much as they expected. But as soon as he called in an airstrike, which wiped out a sizable contingent of Japanese forces, the power of Allied air power brought them flooding in their droves, saying, right, we want to work with you. And so he continued in the field with Operation Camel, and when he walked back through the lines to the commander of 15 Corps headquarters, General Christensen said they were apparently very surprised to see him. They thought he'd been being held against his will by these Arakanese nationalists. And he said, no, you're arresting all of my agents. Stop, the Civil Affairs Service, they're arresting all my agents. And Christensen pulled this cover off of his map and said, well, here's my intelligence sources. And Carew said, well, they're all mine, every single one of them, and you're arresting them. This is all going to collapse. And so Christensen is immediately on side and says, right, well, you best carry on then, hadn't you? And this is, again, is a real moment in the genesis of SOE and making sure the operations of 1945 go ahead, because it gets the army on side. They suddenly realise, actually, this organisation is doing much more than we thought. We didn't actually know how much they're doing. And I think a lot of that is SOE's fault. There'd been too much cloak and dagger. They'd been absolutely paranoid about security. And to the extent that people who needed to know within British military didn't. So Tom Carew, very successful. A brilliant book about her dad there. I can't recommend this book enough. Excellent read about Tom Carew in Dadland there. He is pivotal in getting the major operation, apart from Operation Character, Operation Nation, into central Burma, which plays a massive part in the success of the race for Rangoon by 14th Army, along with Operation.
Okay, let's stop there and just say, okay, if you haven't got it registered Dadland, you need to read it. It's quite an extraordinary story. It reinforces the view that I've got that single men like Tom Carew can achieve dramatic things. If in Arakan all of the intelligence coming in, operational intelligence coming into 15 Corps was from SOE, Tom Carew was responsible for it. And the story is remarkable.
80% of intelligence.
It's remarkable. Okay, and a very, very good story. We need to move on because we're reaching 1944, 1945, 1943, which is described as a period of experimentation where things didn't go particularly well. Rich has made the point about that airstrike and that hit the mule lines, the Japanese mule lines. One of the problems that we had in trying to persuade anyone in Burma to support the Allies was the challenge, well, prove it. Show us what you've got. You know, when you ring up, and when you radio in for air support, do we get it? Do we get an airdrop by C-47 that night? And by 1944, all these things were happening. And agents like Tom Carew who were actually physically able to direct operations on the ground in a new way that was able to persuade Aung San that actually the British were able to engineer. You need to read Dadland to read the story of Tom Carew and Aung San. I mean, that relationship was a personal one. And the effect of one person doing quite amazing strategic things is really extraordinary to recollect. The decisions aren't always those that are made in the ivory towers, but are made on the ground under the rain, the monsoon rain, with discussions with Burmese generals. So all the political issues aside, by 1944, late 1944, we then start getting significant military operations, Richard, in Burma. Can you just give us a sense of what those operations were? You mentioned Nation, and we'll then move on and have a quick chat about character. But Nation was the first one that really led the way.
Yeah. So far we've mentioned some pivotal British officers, but I don't think it would be fair to forget some really pivotal Burmese officers too, such as Lieutenant Barjaw here, Honorary Lieutenant Kanchok, and some Kachin officers, which I'll show you on later slides. These men went in first. These Burmese went in first, whether they were Karen, Chin, Chinese radio operators going with them. There's a lot of indigenous personnel from Southeast Asia going in first, trying to see if it was safe for the British officers to go in. Barjaw was one of these. He was executed with Seagram when he was captured by the Japanese. Operation Harlington was the main aim of it was to find out if Seagram was alive and if there would be any resistance in the Karen Hills. And Barjaw and a team of 3 more Karen were parachuted in February 1943. And the idea was that they would send a signal up to the airplane when it came back, and then the British team would jump in. They didn't have a WT. They didn't have the wireless transmitter. And they didn't manage to get, for various reasons, such as an acid leak from these new the jelly acid in the battery packs had sweated in the heat of India and had leaked onto all these containers and parachutes. And there was this story going around that someone's sabotaging our missions. They've poured acid all over our parachutes, when they eventually found out it was climatic conditions and batteries which had done it. So for various reasons, including navigational error and battery acid, they weren't able to get anyone into that Karen team until October, so 8 months later. Immense frustration for those in charge of Burma Country Section. Absolutely immense frustration comes shining through in the reports. But eventually you get these 2 officers that are showing now parachuted in. For a short while, they contact Seagram, the WT kit goes in, they've got 3 wireless transmitters coming out of the Karen Hills from December 1943, and then early February it all goes quiet. And they think, what the hell's going on here? What's happened to these guys? The 2 officers you can see here, Nemo and McCrindle, were shot when the Japanese attacked their hideouts, and it led to Seagram surrendering himself to the Japanese to prevent the reprisals against the Japanese. But lots of important work is done here, and these men paid for it with their lives. They didn't get to see the fruits of their endeavours, unfortunately. Here's some more officers. These were officers that were the ones sent in first on Operation Dilwin. And I've just recently discovered Zhao Jun's little book there, which is quite an interesting little one you can pick up on Amazon for a few quid. So these 2 guys were absolutely instrumental in getting Operation Dilwin working, bringing the Kachin into SOE, and making sure that Dilwin was such a success. And it's the Dilwin operation which was providing the Americans and Slim with so much intelligence from northern Burma that, again, Slim didn't know it was coming from SOE. He thought it was the American OSS. And so these indigenous officers are absolutely pivotal in making sure that that this intelligence was coming out. And they maintained Dilwin in the field all the way through until the end of the war. And this, again, why it's pivotal is because it convinces the army that actually SOE is doing something worthwhile.
So SOE is doing something worthwhile. I'm conscious of time. It's important now, we'll leap forward. In December 1944, the big battles of Imphal and Kohima had been won. Slim had persuaded Mountbatten, and Mountbatten had persuaded London that 14th Army should just continue across the Chinwin and see what it could do against the 15th Army, the reconstituted 15th Army in Upper Burma, and the reconquest of Burma begins. At this stage, there is an opportunity for SOE to transition from intelligence gathering in a quite early or nascent way into actually undertaking military operations in support of the 14th Army. And we don't have a huge amount of time, Richard, but we've got the conversation here between Mountbatten and Lease. Mountbatten insisting that the military make the most of SOE operations that might otherwise be regarded as as too political. And and because we've got time, could you quickly explain the decision making that led to Slim to decide to use SOE in an offensive capacity, and then we'll look at character.
Yeah, these teams nearly didn't go, and that's the letter from Mountbatten I was referring to earlier. Slim still wanted intelligence, and some special groups were a bit upset to find that they were only going to be used in an intelligence role. But Slim realised just how much of an asset it would be to have thousands of guerrillas on the flank of his advance on Rangoon, and he was all for it. He said, yeah, let's go. So here you've got a picture of one of those special groups. This is Otter. This was sent to me by the son of Sergeant Pearson. He's attached himself to the top left of the photo there. I don't know why he wasn't there for the photo when it was taken, but he's obviously kept this. So that's what a special group looks like. It is mixed ethnicities. There's a Kuki in there. There's Kachin. There are Ba Maw. So any idea that indigenous Burmese didn't work together and took orders from each other is nonsense. They worked together with SOE with some stunning results in these special groups who had all been retrained, specially trained, and joined by Jedburghs fresh out from Europe in Ceylon. And in they go into the Harlington area as Operation Character. And the next slide shows you a map of the front line and where these SOE teams, now we can call it Force 136, where these Force 136 teams were. Right in front of the Army's advance, separated by the Pegu Yomus and the Arakan Yomus as well.
So let's just quickly summarise here. The advancing 14th Army from December 1944 gets to the Irrawaddy in late January, early February 1944, and we then have the Battle of the Irrawaddy Shore. So General Kimura, who's the new commander of the Burma Area Army, against the 14th Army, and Slim fights the Japanese around Mandalay, but most significantly launches a strategic feint against Mektila, which is a very significant railway and logistics hub south of Mandalay, and defeats the Japanese in central Burma. The challenge now is getting from Mandalay Mektila to Rangoon. The monsoon is coming. The monsoon comes in May. In the UK, we have 34. We complain about the rain. We get 34, 35 inches a year. In the hills, the Naga Hills around Manipur, is anything between 350 and 500 inches a year. So when we talk about rain, we're talking about lots of it, and most of it comes with the monsoon. So Slim needed to be in Rangoon by May. Otherwise, the roads would be clogged. The amphibious support operation, Operation Dracula, wouldn't be able to be launched, or would be launched into the teeth of the enemy. So Slim had this strategic conundrum. He had to get very quickly from Mektila to Rangoon down effectively one poor road, astride which lay the town of Toungoo. Now, we're talking about the distance from Paris to Marseille. How do you do that in a month? You've got one armoured corps, the 4th Armoured Corps. Its fuel is flown in by C-47s, and drums of fuel are rolled out of the C-47s. Royal Engineers and Indian engineers fly forward, capture airstrips, C-47s come and roll out the fuel for the tanks to keep on rolling. But if the Japanese were to strengthen Toungoo and defend Toungoo, there's no way the 4th Armoured Corps would ever get down that road, which would mean that the Japanese wouldn't be forced to leave Rangoon, which would mean that the Operation Dracula, the amphibious attack against Rangoon, would be opposed. And the last thing as an incoming amphibious commander you want is to be opposed. That was the primary lesson of the Second World War. Don't launch an opposed landing. Launch a landing where you're not going to be opposed. So these were conundrums that Slim was faced with, that Mountbatten were faced with. You know, they were arguably unanswerable. But Slim had one fabulous golf club in his golf bag. Come on, Richard, character.
Yeah, so character covered a tremendous geographical area. It consisted in the end of about 120 British personnel, and in character alone they raised something like 12,000 karen, not including the special groups that were flown in as well. 12,000 men is about the size of a division. Imagine those hitting your flank every time you tried to move. So you got the Japanese trying to withdraw south to get to Tongu to block the advance of 14th Army. They've been told, the character teams, that they should start fighting only when Slim gave the order. This is part of the discussion on the 30th of December 1944 was that SOE will come under Army command and you go when Slim says so. In fact, they had to start fighting before Slim said so because things were happening on the ground. This is often the way. Slim gave the order on about the 13th of April, said, go on, right, go into action. Let's start hitting these Japanese and let's stop them from getting to Tongu before our own forces do. And Walrus, which was the northernmost team under Lieutenant Colonel Cromarty Tulloch, another very colourful figure. He needs a biography, if anyone did. He's an extraordinary character. And then Peacock's special group, along with the special group you just saw, which was originally designated Ferret under Pixie Poles, Major Eustace Poles. They nearly didn't go because of the infighting within the British camp, but they get flown in on the 23rd of February 1945. There's a mess up with the landing zones, so 3 special groups are landed on Peacock's landing zone, which convinced the Karens to come and fight. And when Slim gives that order, some of them have been in the field for about 6 weeks. Walrus had been in about 16 days, something like that, but they've begun training those that they've recruited, stiffened by those Burma Rifles personnel that we spoke about earlier, who had remained in their villages. And they raise mobile levies, ones that are going to go on ambushes and do the guerrilla war, and those that were called static levies, which you just saw a picture of, who were to guard the villages, make sure the Japanese couldn't get in the villages, prevent them from getting food, prevent them from getting shelter, and move them on. So to get to Tongu, there's a road between Mochi and Tongu. Otter set up its headquarters on Mount Sosiso, which is about 7 or 8 kilometres overlooking Mochi, where the Japanese were regrouping. They tried to go down the road towards Tongu, and the Karens and everyone else in those special groups were let loose on them, and they did not get through. And there's some remarkable pictures in here of the blown up bridges, the lorries, and the complete destruction of the Japanese. They changed tactics, sending infantry ahead of their lorries, still didn't work, and 14th Army won that race to Tongu as a result, clearly, of SOE operations, of the operations carried out by the character teams.
Only because of the operations carried out by the character teams. SOE had what they called a game book, where the 14th Army was determined only to accurately count the bodies in the battlefield. There were no inflated claims coming in from the field. Some of the SOE agents were quite extraordinary men, and on one occasion Slim asked where the intelligence came from, he was told the name of the man that it came from. He said, well, I trust it. More Japanese soldiers were killed in the race for Tongu by SOE, by Operation Character, by these armed Karen and other levies than were killed by conventional forces. But even more than the numbers of enemy killed was the fact that the Japanese were unable to group on Tongu. So that was the strategic effect. So if we've run out of time, if we were to ask the question, what was the strategic effect of SOE in Burma in 1945, you couldn't have predicted it in 1943. Operations were experimental. They were actually, in the words of one report, disastrous. They didn't give anyone any confidence that the war, that unconventional operations of this kind could actually work. But by the doggedness and the determination and the courage of a small number of men, Tom Carew, Peacock, and a few others, the evidence of what could be done on the other side of the the river, the Dilwin, the other side of the fence, was demonstrated to the Army High Command, effectively Slim and his corps commanders, and this was put into ruthless effect in 1945 with Operation Character in particular. There wasn't a piece of that road from Mort Chi that was not dominated entirely by SOE in 1945. And just think what might have happened had Toungoo fallen to if the Japanese had captured Toungoo. The Japanese were withdrawing from Mektila and Mandalay, but they were by no means defeated. In fact, they kept on fighting well after August the 15th, 1945, until they were personally persuaded by Japanese soldiers that Hirohito's surrender order was valid. If the Japanese had captured Toungoo, Slim would not have got to Rangoon. Operation Dracula probably would have been a failure because it would have been in the teeth of very significant Japanese opposition, and Burma would not have fallen before the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And that's fundamental for lots and lots of really good reasons, but we don't have time to talk about it now because we have eaten into question time. I'm afraid you get the two of us together and we could talk for 2 or 3 hours and we don't really get to the point. So what do I want you to take away from this? Well, the first thing is that Richard's book is really groundbreaking. It really does, for the first time, unveil something that none of us knew about the strategic dimension of special forces in Burma, because we've been careful of my language. We have. There are lots of very good stories about other operations that took place, not least of all those undertaken on Operation Thursday in 1944, the noise of which completely drowns out the dramatic success of SOE in 1945. So my message as a historian is to say, so what? Look at the effect of what happened and make your judgment accordingly. Character and SOE in 1945 was a war-winning weapon in the hands of Bill Slim, the 14th Army and Southeast Asia Command, without which the entire story of 45, the dramatic successes of Mandalay, Mektila, and Rangoon would not have been the same. There we are.